The generator kicked twice and caught on the third pull, and Wren Holloway stood in the cucumber rows at 2 in the morning holding a rigged floodlight over vines that were dying anyway. Behind her, past the fence line, 3 trucks had pulled up with their headlights off, engines idling, men leaning against the tailgates just to watch. Someone had a phone out, filming. Somewhere in that little crowd, Dale Kestrel was laughing loud enough for her to hear it over the wind. She didn't turn around. She adjusted the angle of the light, checked the timer clipped to her belt, and kept walking the row. If this didn't work, she wouldn't just lose the cucumbers. She'd lose the contract that was keeping the farm out of the bank's hands, and there would be no fixing that with a rigged light and a stubborn streak. She had 4 nights left before the co-op's inspector came through. 4 nights to prove that everyone watching from the fence line was wrong. Behind her, the treated rows stood dark and quiet against the wind, and somewhere underneath, the noise of the generator and the low laughter carrying over from the trucks. She could hear her own voice from 6 weeks earlier telling her father she had this handled, back before she had any real idea whether that was true. As stories about people who keep going after everyone's written them off are the ones that keep you here until the end. Stick around for this one. 6 weeks earlier, none of this had seemed necessary. The Holloway place ran 11 acres of pickling cucumbers under contract to the county co-op, the same deal Wren's father had signed every year since before she could reach the top of the porch rail. That summer he'd torn his shoulder loading feed, and the doctor had him in a sling through harvest, which left 17-year-old Wren running the crop on her own for the first time, with her mother handling the books and her father shouting instructions from a lawn chair he wasn't supposed to be out of. Nobody in the valley thought that was a real problem. Cucumbers were forgiving. Wren had worked the rows since she was 9. The problem showed up in late July as a dusting of white on the underside of the leaves, easy to miss until it wasn't. Powdery mildew had come through the valley before, but never this early and never this fast. By the second week, it had reached the Kestrel operation next door, a much bigger commercial spread that ran 300 acres and had never once needed Wren's family for anything. Dale Kestrel sprayed his fields with the sulfur fungicide every grower in the county used, twice a week, right on schedule, and it knocked his outbreak back enough to keep his yield respectable. Wren tried the same thing on her 11 acres and watched the mildew keep spreading anyway, a little slower but spreading. Sulfur worked fine on fields sprayed early and often. She'd started 2 weeks behind and couldn't afford enough of it to catch up. "You're wasting good chemical on a crop that's already gone," Dale told her at the feed store, not unkindly, just certain. "Sell what you can before the whole patch turns and start fresh next season." He wasn't trying to be cruel. He genuinely believed it. Everyone did. Her mother had already started quietly asking around about work in town in case the contract fell through. Wren kept working the rows anyway. It wasn't that she had a real plan yet. Stopping simply felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. She was the one out there most mornings, checking leaves, cutting the worst of the infected growth to slow the spread, watching the disease win a little more ground every few days regardless of what she tried. It was on one of those mornings, half asleep over a stack of her father's old agricultural extension bulletins looking for anything she hadn't tried yet, that she found a single paragraph buried in a decade-old research summary about ultraviolet light suppressing powdery mildew in greenhouse cucumbers. Not daytime sun. Short bursts of UVC light applied at night on a strict schedule. It didn't make obvious sense to her. Sunlight was supposed to help plants, not fungus control. But the paragraph explained it plainly enough. The fungus was more vulnerable in darkness, and a precise dose of UVC damaged its cells directly, while daylight afterward repaired any damage to the plant's own tissue before it became a problem. Get the dose wrong, and you'd scorch the leaves. Get it right, and the plants would recover fine, while the fungus didn't. Nobody she knew had ever used it. It wasn't a method, exactly. It was a footnote nobody had followed up on outside of a lab. She read the paragraph 3 times before it started, to make sense to her the way it would eventually make sense to Otis and, much later, to Dale. Powdery mildew spent its nights repairing whatever daytime sunlight had damaged in its cells, using the dark hours to rebuild for the next day's growth. A short, precise dose of UVC light delivered during that repair window did more damage than the fungus could recover from before morning. Cucumber leaves, by comparison, had their own repair systems that kicked in once daylight returned, undoing the same kind of cellular damage in the plant tissue that the fungus couldn't undo in itself. The trick wasn't fighting the mildew during the day, when the plant needed all the sunlight it could get. It was catching the fungus during the one stretch of each cycle, when it was weakest and the plant could still bounce back. She had no greenhouse, no research budget, and no UV equipment built for farm use. What she had was a truck battery, a chicken coop heat lamp housing rewired to hold germicidal UV bulbs ordered off the back of a hardware catalog, and a timer meant for holiday lights. She built the rig in the barn over 2 nights, mostly by guesswork, and walked it out to the first row before dawn on a Tuesday, running the light along the plants at the dose the bulletin had described for a related crop. There was no exact chart for what she was doing, so she scaled the numbers down and adjusted the rest by feel. The first attempt scorched half a row. She'd left the light too close for too long, and by morning the leaves nearest the lamp had gone brittle and brown at the edges, worse off than the mildew had left them. She sat in the dirt at sunrise and let herself be furious about it for exactly as long as it took to drink a cup of coffee. Then she went back to the bulletin, did the math again, and cut the exposure time nearly in half. Word had already gotten around by then that Wren Holloway was out in her field at night with some kind of rigged light, and the valley did what small valleys do with a story like that. By the second week, it wasn't just Dale driving past slow to look. People parked. A few brought lawn chairs, like it was something to watch, rather than something happening to a family that stood to lose its livelihood over it. Wren tried not to think about the audience. She had bigger problems. The timer failed on the 4th night and left the light running 3 times longer than it should have, burning a second row worse than the first. She rebuilt the timing circuit herself, checked it twice before every use after that, and kept going. Nell Ferris, who ran the diner in town and had known Wren since she was in diapers, stopped by the farm stand that same week with a box of blueberry muffins nobody had asked for, and a question she clearly hadn't come just to ask. "Folks are saying you're out there talking to your cucumbers with a lamp," she said, half a joke, half genuine concern. "Your mother doing all right with all this?" Wren said her mother was fine, which wasn't entirely true, and Nell didn't push. But she left the muffins and a look that stayed with Wren longer than the joke did. That look followed her back out to the field, past the fence where 2 more trucks had pulled in since morning, and settled somewhere in her chest that no amount of adjusting the lamp angle could quite shake loose. It was one thing to be laughed at. It was another to have people worry quietly that the worry was justified. It was Otis Reyes who broke from the crowd first. Otis had farmed the valley longer than almost anyone, mostly retired now, and he'd known Wren's father since before she was born. He didn't come to laugh. He came out one morning while she was checking the rows and stood at the fence a long while before he said anything. "You know what you're doing out there?" he asked, not unkindly but not convinced either. Not entirely, Wren admitted. I know what the mildew doesn't like. I'm figuring out the rest as I go. Otis studied the burned patches on the 2 ruined rows, then studied the one she'd already treated properly, where the white dusting on the leaves had visibly thinned. He didn't say much else that day, but he came back 3 mornings later, and the morning after that, standing at the fence a little longer each time, watching the difference between the treated rows and the untreated ones start to separate from each other in a way that wasn't hard to see even from a distance. The middle stretch of the season was the hardest. 2 more setbacks tested her before the method started to hold. A windstorm in early August knocked the rigged lamp housing loose from its mount, cracking one of the bulbs and forcing her to drive 40 minutes to the next town, over for a replacement she couldn't really afford. A week after that, a spell of unusually warm, humid nights sped the mildew spread faster than her rig could keep pace across all 11 acres, and for a few days it looked like the disease might outrun her no matter what she did. She didn't sleep much through any of it. She adjusted the schedule to hit the worst affected rows twice as often, sacrificing coverage on the rows that were holding steadiest, betting that the plants doing fine could wait while the ones in real trouble couldn't. There was a night in the middle of that stretch when the bet nearly cost her everything. She'd been running on maybe 9 hours of sleep across 3 days, moving the rig row to row in the dark, when her boot caught a support stick, and she went down hard enough to knock the wind out of her, the lamp housing skidding into the mud a few feet away. She lay there a moment longer than she meant to, staring up at a sky with no moon in it, and let herself consider, just for that moment, whether Dale had been right back at the feed store. Whether the smart thing, the responsible thing, would have been to sell what she could in July and start over clean. Then she got up, checked the lamp for cracks, found none, and kept walking the row. She never told anyone about that night. It didn't feel like the kind of thing that belonged in the story, even though it was the truest part of it. By late August, the gamble started to show. The rows she'd treated consistently were noticeably cleaner than anything else in the valley, cleaner even than Dale Kestrel's sprayed fields, where the sulfur treatments were losing ground to a particularly stubborn strain that had built up some tolerance over the season. Dale noticed it before anyone forced him to. He drove past one evening, slowed, then actually stopped and got out, walking the fence line the way Otis had weeks before. "That's not luck," he said, mostly to himself, crouching down to look at a leaf that should have been coated white by that point in the season and wasn't. "No," Wren said. "It's a light schedule and a lot of burned rows before I got it right." He didn't say much else that visit either, but he stopped telling people at the feed store that her crop was already gone. The real test came in the second week of September, 10 days before the co-op's inspection, when a hard, sudden heat wave rolled through the valley right alongside a fresh wave of the mildew outbreak. It was the worst combination the season could have thrown at anyone. Warm, humid nights that gave the fungus exactly the conditions it wanted, paired with heat stress that left plants across the county with nothing left to fight it with. 2 other small growers lost enough of their crop that week to fall out of contract with the co-op entirely. Dale's operation held on, but barely, and only by doubling his chemical applications at a cost that ate most of his margin for the season. He mentioned that number to Wren later, once the season had settled, in the tone of a man doing math he didn't enjoy doing. Wren's 11 acres held without any of that. She didn't sleep more than a few hours a night that week, walking the rows with the rig, adjusting doses by feel as the heat changed how the plants responded, catching the 2 rows that started to slip before they could spread the outbreak back into the ones that were holding. When the inspector from the co-op walked her fields 10 days later, he spent a long time on his knees checking the undersides of leaves before he said anything at all. "I've walked a lot of fields already this month," he told her. "Most of them worse off than they were in July. Yours look better than they did in June." He didn't ask how. She told him anyway, plainly, the same way Otis had eventually gotten the explanation out of her at the fence line, and he wrote something down in his notebook that she never did find out the words to. Before he left, he glanced back at the rig sitting quiet in the barn doorway, wires taped and retaped, timer housing dented from the storm, and said only that he'd seen a lot of setups in his years walking fields, and none of them had looked like that. The contract held. That alone would have been enough for Wren, but the valley wasn't finished with the story. Once the crowds that had gathered to watch her fail started noticing that she hadn't, curiosity did what it usually does. People who'd once parked in lawn chairs to watch a girl embarrass herself started showing up at the fence with actual questions instead. Otis was first to ask if she'd walk him through building a rig of his own, and she did, standing in his barn one Saturday explaining the timer circuit the same plain way the old bulletin had explained it to her. Dale took longer to come around, pride being what it is, but by the following spring he'd quietly installed UV lamps in 2 of his greenhouse sections, testing the method on a scale she couldn't have managed, with a truck battery and a chicken coop lamp. Neither of them called it luck by then. Nobody in the valley did anymore. By October, the co-op started fielding calls from growers 2 counties over who'd heard some version of the story, secondhand, and wanted to know if it was true, and if it was, whether someone could explain it to them the way Wren had explained it to Otis at his own fence line. She wasn't sure what to make of that at first. The rig had been built out of a chicken coop lamp and a holiday timer simply out of necessity, not out of any plan to teach it to anyone else. Still, she drove out to 2 of those farms that fall, walked their rows the same plain way, and left each of them with a rough sketch of the wiring and the dosing schedule, scratched onto a paper feed sack, the only paper either place had lying around. By the next harvest, Wren's rig had been rebuilt twice more, each version a little more reliable than the last, timers replaced with something sturdier, the lamp housing reinforced against wind after that August storm had taught her the hard way what it couldn't survive. Her father's shoulder healed enough for him to work again, though he mostly stood at the fence some mornings now, watching his daughter walk the rows the way he used to, holding a light instead of a hoe. He didn't say much about it. He didn't have to. Some mornings he'd just hand her a fresh bulb from town before she asked for one, or check the timer circuit himself while she got a few extra minutes of sleep, small, quiet corrections to a season that had nearly gone very differently. The valley still gets powdery mildew most years. It probably always will. The disease never stopped coming. What changed is that a 17-year-old girl spent a summer figuring out, row by row and mistake by mistake, that the thing everyone laughed at from their trucks in the dark was never as strange as it looked from a distance. It just needed someone stubborn enough to keep adjusting the dose until it worked. Somewhere out past the fence line, the trucks don't idle at night anymore. Nobody's watching to see her fail. A few of them are out there now with lights of their own, learning the same lesson she did the hard way, one burned row at a time.